Hi, good afternoon. Let me welcome you all for this afternoon's discussion on Sino-Indian relations. The title is Sino-Indian Relations after the Wuhan Summit. We have Dr. Manoj Joshi to speak on the subject. I can certainly vouch for him. I've known him for more than 40 years. Did our PhDs together in JNU, and then we were colleagues in the Hindu for a while. We were colleagues in Observer Research Foundation. Dr. Joshi is a specialist on American history, but then over the last 40 years, I think he's covered India's defense issues, India's foreign policy issues in quite an intensive manner. And he has deep knowledge of India's security and foreign policy. And he's covered the India-China relationship quite extensively over the last 3 decades and more. So it's a delight to have him here. And what we're going to do is he's going to speak for about 30-odd minutes, 25-30 minutes. And after that, we'll have the Q&A session. But before he starts, just one thought that the Wuhan summit was seen as a decisive moment because 2016 and 2017 were quite bad years for India-China relationship. In 2016, the conflict over the nuclear issue bubbled over. In 2017, where India became the first country to put up a formal critique of the Belt and Road Initiative, India was one of the few countries that did not participate. And then immediately after that, we had this military confrontation in the Doklam Plateau of Bhutan. So it is that conflict that actually Dr. Joshi followed it quite closely, that the two leaders decided that, look, time has come to take a deep breath, sit down and actually go back to the basics to say what is wrong with the relationship or how do we manage the relationship. Unlike in the years before, Xi Jinping and Modi, and before that Manmohan Singh, we've had far more frequent meetings because both of us are members of many multilateral organizations, the BRICS, for example, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization now, and G20, East Asia Summit. So the number of forums where the Indian and Chinese leaders met, say half an hour, 45 minutes, but the meetings have become very frequent. But in some senses, they still did not really involve a substantive discussion of the differences. And you take away the translation time, you can have any number of meetings of 20 minutes each, but they're not going to produce outcomes. But what we saw in terms of the diplomatic process was they spent a day and a half, multiple meetings, just the two of them in a retreat kind of a setting. And then they had intensive sessions on a whole range of issues. It's not for me to say at this point, anything great has come out of it, but the optics, the tone certainly have changed. And given China's own complexities with other powers, probably we are at a moment where India-China relationship can actually probably evolve. Nothing can be said definitively in a direction that is different from what we've seen in the last few years. So now, Dr. Joshi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Raj. It's a great privilege to be here at ISAS and with my friend Raja Mohan. As he said, we go back a long time to our PhD days where we were batchmates and also neighbors in our residence in the hostel. And we have been closely associated with each other as friends more than anything else. So I'm going to speak about the Wuhan summit, but I will range back as well to some extent. And so if you look at the recent Wuhan summit outcome, you can interpret it in multiple ways. So if you look at the, both sides issued their press releases. There was no other, there were delegation level talks, but they issued the Indian press release of April 28th, said it will be a positive factor for stability amidst the current global uncertainties. It would be conducive for the development and prosperity of the region and create the conditions for an Asian century. That's the Indian press release. Both the Chinese and the Indian press releases emphasized that the two countries have the maturity and wisdom to handle differences through peaceful discussion. So I think this was an important statement they wanted to make. But a major significance of the meeting was, which was billed as an informal summit, was to put strategic communication. Now this is the new kind of terminology which has come in, that they wanted to put strategic communication or high-level interaction between the two companies on a new plane. Because often when we were having the difficult years, 2016, 2017, they said that we're not having enough strategic communication. So one of the purposes was this strategic communications. While meetings between officials and of the two countries, they take place regularly. There's a certain routine to meetings, Commerce Ministry, Finance Ministry, and other ministries take place regularly. The Wuhan summit has inaugurated a new era of diplomacy where the top leaders plan to meet more frequently, and they do it in a way that involves going into much greater detail in their relationship, free from the constraints of protocol. And that's why if you see the summit of April 27, 28, the two leaders had 6 rounds of talks, 4 that were one-to-one with only interpreters present, reflecting a mutual belief in the value of personal diplomacy. Now you can imagine with anyone, I'm saying, you have 4 rounds of talks and too intense this thing, I'm saying you virtually discuss everything, everything's on the table in front of you. So I'm presuming that their talks must have covered a great deal of ground, enabling better understanding of each other's perspective. I think that was the purpose on developments both of their respective countries and the world around them. So in this, in these, as I said, 4 one-on-one rounds, and of course, as Raj says, there's the issue of translation. But even so, this was an opportunity for extremely intense discussion. Of course, there were also delegation level talks between them. Now, what the summit has done, at the kind of surface level, is to show the world that China and India may have troubled relations, but their leaders have the maturity to understand when things are getting out of hand, and the political will to do something about it. So it's not, we don't need third parties to come and tell us that, no, you guys better, shape up, otherwise you'll be in trouble. So I think that there was a certain recognition in both countries that something needed to be done. That the two countries do not want any clash to take place because of miscalculation. Now these are two nuclear armed countries with their armies facing each other. So they want to make sure that there is no miscalculation or misunderstanding. Now in that sense, it should be seen as the beginning of a new process in the relationship, just as the ones have been established by the visits of Rajiv Gandhi in 1988 and Atal Bihari Vajpayee in 2003. So this process where we took on at the summit level, so when Rajiv Gandhi went to China in 1988 and when Mr. Vajpayee went in 2003, these were also seen as kind of turning points in the relationship. I'll discuss some of this a little later. Now, in practical terms, the Wuhan summit signaled an effort to develop, as I said, as both their press releases noted, a common understanding on overarching issues of bilateral and global importance. So both press releases mentioned this. Likewise, both press releases noted that they saw themselves as powers with decisional and strategic autonomy. Now this again is kind of code word to say that, look, we make our own decisions. And this was an important, the restatement of strategic autonomy, and as I said, this figured in both press releases, was basically a signal that, look, we are not our foreign policy is not at the behest of any third party. Now the immediate fallouts of this have been noted in the Indian media, but not the Chinese. The first was the decision to set up an India-China hotline at the level of the Director General of Military Operations. The second was a set of instructions that were sent down to the Indian Army, according to because as I said, the Chinese didn't have this, to the Indian Army to maintain peace on the border, avoid excessively aggressive patrolling tactics, and following the 2005 protocol in dealing with the PLA on the border. So these instructions were given to the Indian forces. Now I'm only presuming that the PLA got similar instructions on their sides, because the Chinese statement actually was quite pithy. It just said, noted merely that the two sides will strengthen confidence building measures and enhance communications and cooperation to uphold peace and tranquility. So this hotline, of course, there's been a bit of a problem. The point is that it's a two different army systems. So the India has a Director General Military Operations. The PLA wants the hotline to be connected to the Western Theatre Command. And so there is a protocol issue out there, so it's stuck up. But that's not important. Now, it may be noted that the Sino-Indian border is marked by about 4,000 or so kilometers, line of actual control, which is a notional line, meaning it's not marked on any map to which both sides agree. So each side has its own set of map, and this is, as I said, a 4,000 kilometer long thing where neither side is agreed as to where exactly the border lies. By and large, it's not a problem, but in about 20 places, there's an overlap of claims. In the sense the Chinese would say that that end of the room is the border. We say, no, this end of the room is the border. And so what happens is that the Chinese will patrol to their extent of the border. We will patrol to our extent of the border. And so there are, well, they call them, it's all very well, it's very choreographed, well choreographed. So what they will do is, and they will show each other flags saying, this is Indian territory, please go back. That's flag 1. Then comes flag 2, saying that you are requested to turn back. This is Indian territory. And then the third time what happens is that they contact each other's higher formation commanders. So it's all choreographed, and in these 20 places these things happen, and these basically are called face-offs. And sometimes there are other things. They push each other, and these are soldiers and they are kind of charged up, and you do have problems. But nothing serious, no shooting has happened in that border since, I think, 1975. Not a shot has been fired in that border. Now, significantly, both the press releases use the same phrase in referring to the importance of the work of the two special representatives. See, we have two special representatives, the Indian National Security Advisor and the Chinese State Councillor Yang Jiechi. Now it's Wang Yi, who's going to be who's the special representative. They are discussing this border resolution of the border issue since 2003. And so the two special representatives, according to the press releases, said that they are still tasked to seek a fair, reasonable, and mutually acceptable settlement to the border question. So I will discuss some of these a little later. But let's look back a bit to the Xi-Modi relationship in the 2014 to 2018. Modi and Xi were both seen as strong leaders. I mean, so Xi became the leader in 2013, Modi in 2014. And when they took office, there were expectations that there would be fairly quick resolution, maybe of the border issue, because with strong leaders they can take the kind of decisions which are needed, because both sides would have to make notional concessions to each other, and so there were expectations that would happen. Both were focused on economic issues. In their first summit in 2015, in 2014, they announced that they were now, India and China was going to have a development partnership. So the emphasis was going to be on economic cooperation between them to build upon an earlier formulation which said that we'll have a strategic and cooperative partnership that had been established in 2005 when Wen Jiabao had come to Delhi. But the signs of trouble were already there, meaning even in 2014. China made an audacious move when Xi Jinping was in Delhi. Chinese forces were, Chinese military personnel were trying to build a road in a place called Chumur in Himachal Pradesh, Ladakh, kind of a border. And they came in. The Indians were ready because we had had this experience before. So the Indians pushed back. So you had actual face-off, as I described it, at the time when Xi Jinping was in India, in Ahmedabad and in Delhi. And Modi raised it with him directly. And Xi Jinping said, no, it will be taken care of. But nothing happened. So only when Xi went back, and only at the end of the month, then the two sides moved back. So this was seen as a kind of a power play at that thing. I mean, in the sense the Chinese leader was in New Delhi, and yet this thing was happening out there. So there was a lot of speculation. Was it someone from the PLA who was trying to undermine the general secretary of the party and the president of the country? But I think mostly people believe that this was an orchestrated thing, that there's no question of Xi's authority being questioned. Because subsequently, the person who was the PLA commander in that area, he was actually promoted. So that means that there was no orders which were disobeyed. So one was this Chumur factor. The second, in April 2015, China upgraded its friendship with Pakistan by announcing this China-Pakistan economic corridor, which meant that something with an investment of some $46 billion. In May 2016, China formally opposed India's efforts to join the nuclear suppliers group. This despite Modi personally taking it up with Xi at the sidelines of the SCO summit in Tashkent on the eve of the Seoul plenary of the NSG. Now this became a bit of a prestige issue, meaning Modi approached Xi and said, look, we want your support for membership into the National Nuclear Suppliers Group. And Xi kind of gave a bland response, but the fact is China did not support. So I think Modi felt that he had kind of lost face in that process. In April 2016, a month earlier, China had blocked India's effort to have the Pakistani terrorist Masood Azhar placed under the UN's 1267 committee list. This is a sanctions list which was made for the Al-Qaeda, and India wanted Masood Azhar also to be on the list, but China had put a block on it. So these things happened. So April you have the Masood Azhar thing, in May you have the NSG thing, and it's not as though India was not doing anything. I mean, when Mr. Modi became Prime Minister, at his inaugural function, he invited the head of the Tibetan government in exile to participate in the celebrations. In April 2016, a clutch of anti-Chinese activists organized a meeting in Dharamshala. And amongst them was an Uyghur leader called Dolkun Isa. But there was a big uproar, so Dolkun Isa was denied the visa. But it was a bit difficult to figure out what exactly was happening, because partly I think that this was being driven by party considerations rather than by the government consideration, in the sense that what was happening was that Mr. Modi's party, BJP, also has an important leader like Ram Madhav, who's also interested in foreign policy. So I think the Dharamshala meeting was probably organized, and the Tibetan activity has been pushed by the party more than anything else. But whatever it is, as far as the Chinese are concerned, they are in any case neuralgic about this issue of Tibet. And so this created a lot of tension. And then, of course, Dalai Lama himself was invited to the Rashtrapati Bhavan, to our presidential palace, though it was for some meeting of another Nobel laureate. But this was the first time the Dalai Lama was at the Rashtrapati Bhavan. And later he was permitted to go to Tawang in early 2017, where he was met by the two ministers. In 2017, of course, May, India famously opposed the BRI forum, and the BRI was formally opposed. It became perhaps the only holdout of the BRI. And then later on in June, the Doklam issue came to the fore, where the two armies again confronted each other, but this time not in Indian territory or Indian claimed territory, but in Bhutan, in a territory which is contested between Bhutan and China. So this Doklam crisis was quite serious. It lasted from 16th of June to 28th of August 2017. And during the time, the rhetoric from Beijing was vitriolic. I had the opportunity to go to Beijing, and it was virtually that if you people do not pull out, there is going to be war. That kind of thing from responsible figures in the system. But the crisis was diffused. The crisis was diffused. And I think the one reason for it was Modi-Xi level meetings. So on July 7th, so I said 16 June to 28th August was the crisis. On July 7th, Modi met Xi at the sidelines of the G20 summit, and they agreed that they should have talks. at the official level to resolve the standoff. And on July 27th, our national security advisor was in Beijing. Again, he was at the sidelines. He was at a BRICS meeting, but he met his counterpart. And I think that is the point where they were able to agree to the standoff. Now, an important aspect of the Chinese agreement on the standoff was that the BRICS summit was going to be held at Xiamen in China. And I think it became very clear that if the crisis is not resolved, Modi was not going to attend. And so that would have been, again, a big loss of face, because if out of the BRICS countries, the 5 BRIC countries, if one of them failed to turn up, and that also an important BRICS country like India, it would have been a big loss of face for China. So all these kind of were mixed up in that process. But this disengagement enabled Modi to go there. But China was also, it was also at the summit, this BRICS summit that was held, that for the first time in the statement that was issued, Jaish-e-Mohammed, meaning this is the Pakistani terrorist group, and the Lashkar-e-Taiba were both named in the official statement, in the BRICS statement. And it is at this point that the Modi and Xi gave instructions to their special representatives, and this is where the informal summit idea came up, which is, as I said, the 2 special representatives met in December of 2017. So what we have, June to August, is the Doklam crisis, and then you have the meeting, and then you have the BRICS meeting in September, and then in December the National Security Advisor and his counterpart meeting. This is the meeting where that informal summit idea was mooted, and subsequently Yang Jiechi, who was being promoted to the Politburo in between here at the 19th Party Congress, he visited Delhi and held the 20th round of special representatives talks with Mr. Doval, his counterpart. And in February this year, our former foreign secretary, who had now become the former ambassador to China, who had become the foreign secretary, visited Beijing. And in Beijing, he made 2 important commitments. One, he gave a very clear indication that India would stop playing the Tibet card. India would stop trying to, sort of needle China on the issue of Tibet. Second is, because there was a parallel crisis on Maldives brewing, he told Beijing very clearly that, look, we have no intentions of getting militarily involved in the Maldives. And especially since, the Chinese had made it very clear that they have certain interests out there. Now, Doval and Yang, that is the 2 special representatives, they also met at the sidelines of the SCO meeting in Shanghai in April 13th, and they finalized that summit, which took place in April 27th and 28th. Now, what does the summit show? One is, it shows the failure of the existing confidence-building measures regime. Now, I'll just list some of them. I'm not going to go in detail. Maybe during the discussion period, you want to raise them. The Doklam crisis was a failure of the regime, in part because it took place in a third country, meaning it was not a direct Sino-Indian thing. It actually had to do with, it happened on the territory of Bhutan. The Indian intervention was acquiesced by Bhutan. This is very carefully, and I use the word acquiesced, and there was no kind of open statement, but the Bhutanese supported it, but not too vigorously. Now, if you look at the confidence-building measures regime, the first one was the Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement in '93. So I spoke to you about the Rajiv Gandhi visit. The important thing of the Rajiv Gandhi visit was that till 1988, India had refused to discuss the border issue with China. They said that unless you vacate the aggression of 1962, there's going to be no discussion, nothing. And so '88, India took the decision that, okay, we will accept that our border today is constituted by a line of actual control, and we can take measures to maintain peace and tranquility there. So this 1993 agreement was a watershed. It's called the BPTA, Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement of '93. After that, there was another subsidiary agreement, very important agreement in 96 called the Protocol on Modalities of Implementation of that CBM. Now, if you actually read these agreements, they're fascinating because they actually talk of a concept of mutual and equal security. What does that mean? It means that, the Indian forces, India's border is high mountains like that, and then there's the plateau. So China has ease of access on the plateau. The Indian forces have difficulty in accessing the mountains. So the idea was, the Indian side said that we can't have equality of pullback, meaning if we are going to pull back, we can't pull back 15 kilometers each, because 15 kilometers in our terrain means the whole day of the going up. In your terrain, it means half an hour. So let's discuss this issue. So this concept came up. Second was that both sides actually committed themselves to thinning out their forces, to thinning out heavy equipment and weapons from that area. The problem was that these agreements were never fully implemented for one simple reason, that there was no mutually accepted line of actual control. That never happened. There was a clause in that agreement which said wherever there are differences, I told you there are about 20 places where there are differences of interpretation. Wherever there are differences, the two sides will get together and settle those differences. That never happened. That never happened because I'm not going to go into that complicated process. So this 1996 agreement was an important one, which actually the two sides were agreeing for a military, thinning out military, reducing military tension in the line of actual control. Then in 2005, there was another protocol on the modalities of implementing the CBMs. Then 2012, there was a working mechanism for consultation and coordination in the Indo-China border affairs. In 2013, we had a border defense cooperation agreement. Now, this was important because this BDCA was actually signed by a PLA officer. And this is where we realized two systems are different. In the sense, in India, the nodal ministry for foreign affairs is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But in China, it doesn't work that way. In China, there are some areas which are the PLA's responsibilities, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs doesn't figure. So these are things which you have to calculate when you do this. So you have the BDCA of 2013. So these BPTA, the CBM and military field, working mechanism for consultation, BDCA, were all the CBMs. Now these are the ones that failed, as I said, when we reached this point of Doklam. In addition, there were, from 2003 onwards, there were 20 meetings of the special representatives. They sat down trying to work out the border. And then their big success of the special representatives was, within 2 years of being created in 2003, they had come up with an agreement on the political parameters and guiding principles for the settlement of the India-China border question. Now, it's a very important agreement which virtually spelt out that the two sides were agreed broadly to exchange their claims. But for a variety of reasons, some political developments, etc., the Chinese resiled from this agreement. And so the agreement stands in the books, but it's kind of not implemented. So this was the kind of stuff which Doklam brought up. And why I detailed this is that the importance of Doklam arises from the fact that all this didn't work in that point, and you reached a point of military confrontation. Of course, there is a facile comparison being made that Modi-Xi summit in Wuhan would be like the Rajiv Gandhi Deng Xiaoping meeting. Both events came in the end after face-offs, had gone well for India. In 86-87, we had an Operation Falcon. The Indian Army, for the first time, looked at the PLA eye to eye and forced it to recognize that the balance of power on the border was no longer the one that prevailed in the 60s. The result of the 88 Rajiv Gandhi visit was that, as I said, that India set aside its demand that that there should be that the Chinese settle the border issue before normalization. So now we said, okay, we will agree to keep the border issue pending, and we'll normalize ties, and that's what we did. And this, as I said, resulted in the two far-reaching agreements of 1993. Now, in conclusion, what I'd like to make some observations. While most observers are agreed that the motives behind the two sides getting together were tactical, I think almost everyone says, no one says that this is a strategic thing. These are tactical considerations. But there is no reason to assume that it cannot have lasting results and yield strategic gains. So the point I'm trying to make is that for a variety of reasons which I listed to you, this informal summit came about. But the people who brought the summit never intended it as a kind of a big strategic shift. But because it has happened and because now the process has begun, there is a possibility that there could be some lasting gains from it and some strategic gains. Beyond the tactical issues of keeping peace in the LAC, the statements emerging suggest that the two leaders are also responding to the rapidly changing geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific and the Eurasian region. Even now, it is difficult for anyone to forecast just how, for example, the North Korean issue will play out, or for that matter, the consequences of a deepening trade war between US and China. Many of us agree that China cannot be prevented from rising as an industrial power, but the steps underway could slow down that pace considerably. One of the key motives and goals for the Wuhan summit, as I said, was to promote strategic communication between the two sides. And as we have pointed out, the existing CBMs, SR dialogue, the special representative dialogue format had lost some of the potency, creating issues that required the summit level intervention. Fortunately, both leaders and the top ministers have initiated that kind of regime. This year, we have already seen the Indian Defense Minister and External Affairs Minister go to Beijing. Now, the Chinese Defense Minister Wei Fenghe is expected in India. Later this year, the 21st round of the special representative talks will take place in Beijing. Prime Minister has met Mr. Xi recently in the Johannesburg summit, BRICS summit, and may meet him again later this year. Visits of military delegations have resumed after at least a 2-year gap. I didn't list the military CBMs, but there was a whole parallel set of military CBMs that also took place. A Chinese delegation led by Lieutenant General Liu Xiaowu, Deputy Commander of the Western Theatre Command, had visited India. Now, the Indian Eastern Command, Lieutenant General Abhay Krishna will visit China. I've mentioned to you the issue of the dialogue, the hotline problem. The challenge for India is to maintain a balance in the competitive and cooperative elements of our relationship with China. So we have both elements are there. Unfortunately, India's own performance, our own economy, and our military reforms, there are gaps there. And unless and until we fill the gaps, we cannot have that kind of, heft to move ahead. And we require external players like the United States to maintain the balance of power. Even as China and India deepen their engagement, India is deepening its ties with the US. There are many upsides for India maintaining its traditional policy of being a swing power in the Indo-Pacific. And India has managed, because of the present geopolitical situation, India is in a bit of a sweet spot. And so what has India managed? India has managed to deflect US sanctions in relation to Russia, the CASTA sanctions. India has just got the STA-1 status with regard to exports of industrial components and products. India is ready to sign the COMCASA agreement, the communications security agreement with the United States, which will actually step up the military cooperation. And in September, we will have a 2+2 dialogue with the United States. So these factors are also there, and what we see is that yes, we may have a swing quality, but because we have had our economy is not doing, is growing in a sustainable manner, and our military reforms have been a bit delayed, we do certainly require the US to help us with the balance of power. Now, as we have seen, no one is going to, engaging China enables New Delhi to prevent or deflect zero-sum outcomes relating to Beijing in the immediate neighborhood in South Asia. This is an important calculation for us. China will no doubt continue the penetration of the region, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, etc. But engagement can ensure that this process is not used to undermine India's security interests. Because if we can discuss these things with China face to face, things can be better. As we pointed out, India has already front-loaded its commitments on Tibet and Maldives. India also pointedly did not invite Australia to join the latest Malabar exercise. No doubt there will be some concessions from China also. And these things come in a subtle... What has happened is that a lot of the diplomacy which tended to be public and shouldn't have been public, meaning the NSG or the Masood Azhar thing should have been done quietly between the diplomats of the two sides, but it became a very public kind of a thing, so media picked it up and kind of what I call megaphone diplomacy. What the Wuhan summit has done is to put it back into the diplomatic discretion, and these things are discussed in the background, discussed quietly, decisions taken without anyone being the wiser and without having a kind of media sort of get into the picture and exacerbate the problem. In recent months, India has also tamped down its criticism of the Belt and Road Initiative. In Wuhan, the two sides took a decision that we will work on a joint project in Afghanistan. Now, this would definitely, Pakistan would not be particularly happy with this. Also, it could be a form of, it could form the model of a three-country cooperation in the region. So instead of confrontation, tension in, let's say, between India and China with regard to Nepal or with regard to Bangladesh, there could be cooperative projects which we could take up. Now, the one example that I can immediately think of was, I think, when the Prime Minister of Nepal went to China, he got a commitment from them for a railroad, for the Shigatse railroad to be extended all the way to the Nepal border. And from the Nepal border, it would go all the way to Kathmandu. And Mr. Modi, when he had gone, he has given a commitment for a survey for a railway from the Indian system up to Kathmandu. Now, so if the two systems meet in Kathmandu, you actually have a first railroad which penetrates the Himalayas and lands up all the way, can go all the way down to the Indian Ocean. So these are possibilities that will happen in the future. Let's see how it works out. We don't know. But I'll just conclude at this point.
Thanks, Manoj. I think you covered a vast ground. Before I open up, just three initial comments. I think you can respond to those. One, as you know that the India-China relationship, there are a lot of words, very big words. Often the big words, Asian century, we're going to be great solidarity. That kind of stuff actually is often used to mask real differences. On the boundary, we don't even agree on the length of the boundary. We say 4,000 kilometers, as you mentioned. They say 2,000. So the scale of the differences and the rhetoric often of this grand, we're going to reinvent the world, India, China together stuff. There is that huge mismatch between the rhetoric and the actual state of the relationship. The second is, you mentioned there's too much process but very little product. You saw how many layers of CBMs were laid out for India-China boundary dispute. I think even those who followed very closely wonder what these mechanisms are about. So is Wuhan actually more process and less substance? And the third point I wanted to ask you was, you said India has front-loaded its commitments. That is, we won't do, oppose you in this and that. Well, Chinese have not really given you anything. So has Wuhan ended up actually the Chinese preventing India from doing too many things with the Americans without actually giving India very much in return? So if you can just respond to this three and then we can open up.
Sure. You're right. The words, the distinct difference between rhetoric and reality. In fact, when I was coming here, I had at least 4 or 5 copies of a paper I had just written, and I forgot it back in my hotel. I wanted to distribute some of the copies here, wherein what I have analyzed Wuhan, but since here I was going to do Wuhan summit and after a kind of an overview, I haven't taken that point. But the point that I have made in my paper, which was published last month, is that unless and until the two countries settle their border dispute, there journey is not going too far. Because that border dispute hangs over us. It's 4,000 kilometers. There are armies on either side. It just takes 10 guys to stroll across it, and you can have a crisis. Meaning, if you remember in 2013, in the Depsang plain in northern Ladakh, Chinese set up 3 tents, and there were 10 men and a dog, which lived there. They had no one could see any weapons, but they were just staying there, and it became a crisis in our relationship, because that was one of the disputed areas, and one of the conditions in those disputed areas is neither side can stay there permanently, meaning you can't build permanent structures. So the point is that my own view is that there is a finite limitation to the Sino-Indian process unless you address the central issue, which is the border. Now, many people disagree with me. People say, no, Chinese will never settle the border, or the Indians will never agree. There's not enough political will to settle it. But my point is, so bad luck, meaning I stick to my point. My point is that this is a problem in the Sino-Indian relationship, and this problem will not go away. It's a pill which is stuck in the throat. You've got to wash it down, or you've got to spit it out. But you can't leave it be. The second point on process and product, again, I agree with you, because it's much too early to actually say that, well, yes, that's why I was very tentative in this thing. I said, well, this is what this press release is saying, this is what this guy is saying, these are what some of the pundits are saying. Will it actually have substance? We don't know. And that leads me to the third point, that India has front-loaded its commitment, and has China succeeded in preventing closer Indo-US ties? And my argument, and that's the point I've made out here, that's Mr. Modi has actually moved quite skillfully, that even while the Wuhan summit, and then he had the Sochi summit with Mr. Putin, what he has done is that he has also signaled closeness to the US, and likewise he has gained some leverage with the US. In the sense, let us see now what happens with the Iran sanctions, but at least with the Russian sanctions, we managed to get a waiver, which is quite something which, in the era of Trump, getting a concession like that is fairly substantial. And plus, as I said, India is also moving forward in its military relationship, the Comcasa business. There are 1 or 2 military acquisitions, National Surface-to-Air Missile System, which India plans to acquire, certain helicopters, naval helicopters, which may happen in this 2+2. Actually, this 2+2 dialogue that's going to take place, that is the US Secretary of State and the US Defense Secretary and their Indian counterparts, will be an important, very important thing to watch. And I'm sure the Chinese will be watching it also very carefully.
Okay, the floor is open. Yeah, sir.
Hi.
You just identify yourself.
Yeah, sure. My name is Ravi Shankar, and I'm a journalist. I'm based here in Singapore. I write around the region. So I have 2 questions directed. One I direct to Dr. Joshi, and the other to you. You say political will. You mentioned political will in tackling India-China border problems. Now, I mean, isn't it obvious that India is a different entity where it comes to politics? China is, it's not a democracy, and it's the way it thinks about the region is very, very clear. And it has not changed since Mao or Deng at the most. So its strategic objectives in the region are clearly spelled out and laid out. I don't want to make a speech, sir.
Just make it a question so that...
Yeah, sure. So, so how come you equate political will of India, which, for instance, my specific question would be, wouldn't you say there's a case that Modi has sold out India's interests because if you follow politics, even the RSS is unhappy with his
No, don't go off into too many things. I mean, you're saying there's Modi given away too much. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And also to you, the transactional foreign policy which is in vogue today, which I understand that you are a strong proponent of. How do you explain?
Okay.
No, I think you have a column or something.
Okay.
So,
Have you sold out?
so has Modi sold out? No, what I'm describing, Modi, see, there are various calculations. A very important calculation for Modi is that he's going in for elections. He's going in for elections between now and 2019. Mr. Modi would like peaceful periphery at this time. Because the one set of, as you know, Mr. Modi has the image of being the strong man, the 56-inch chest. Now the point is, the only people who can deflate that are the Chinese. If they create an incident somewhere on the border, and this 4,000-kilometer border, there are lots of places where the Chinese are in a dominating position. So in a dominating position, see the Chumor thing which I described to you, strangely enough, India is in a dominating position, yet the Chinese try to take advantage of it. But if in another place the Chinese create a crisis, then Mr. Modi's image could take a battering, and this could have electoral consequences. So I think this was an extremely important motive for Mr. Modi. So that's why I said it is a tactical move. It's a tactical move, can have strategic consequences. But selling out is too strong a word, because he has simultaneously, as I myself have described to you, that what he has done is that he has simultaneously also signaled his decision to maintain and develop close ties with the United States. So this could hardly be, so what he's doing is balancing. Our great asset in the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific is that we are a swing power. That all the other powers are either, Japan or others are actually identified with the US. They're US allies. We are nobody's allies. So it's still worth China's effort to prevent us from joining the American camp. And it is still worth our effort to keep on signaling that maybe we will join the Americans if you guys don't behave. So, this tension remains, and I think Mr. Modi is playing with it.
Look, I think on the transaction thing, yes, I mean, I've made the argument that India should be explicitly, overtly be transactional in its engagement with other countries. Now, foreign policy is always transactional. It is the pretense that we often overload it with romanticism, sentiment, as if this is about higher goals. Now, the same Indian politicians who, ready to switch alliances, do all kinds of things, pretend that foreign policy is somehow a moral politic, that somehow this is about higher principles. For example, as I said, in the Chinese case itself, the references to Asian century, the references to we will build, just hang in, you had your question. Yeah, that we seem to confuse the longer term ideological sentiments that have bound India and China often, that they're not enough to resolve functional issues like on territory, trade deficit. These can't be sorted out by saying, oh, we're going to be great Asian brothers. The problem is, in spite of saying that, we've not been able to resolve. So the need for pragmatism of recognizing the problems between India and China are real, and that we need to keep addressing those. That is what one has argued. And to that extent, I mean, I don't think there's any foreign policy between any two states that is not transactional in its essence. Chan, you wanted to?
Thank you, Dr. Joshi, for the insightful discourse. My name is Chan. Just want to ask that, okay, so for the Wuhan summit, you mentioned that both sides actually feel that there's a need for enhancement of strategic communications, you mentioned. I just want to ask on India's side, this strategic communications effort, how do you think it actually fares in the face of actually existing more aggressive strategies such as the Dover Doctrine? I know the Dover Doctrine is not actually a doctrine by itself, it's a general sort of consensus that by of course the Secretary Dover that any violent action against India would be faced with more robust response. So do you see actually they are mutually exclusive or inclusive in terms of strategic communication and the Dover Doctrine? Thank you.
No, not really, because, in the sense, as the special representative, Mr. Doval is the key point man for all policy relating to China. And he, as I outlined to you, he was the guy who met his Chinese counterparts the most frequently. In the last, ever since the crisis, he met them during the crisis, he met them immediately after the crisis, he helped in resolving the... So what I'm saying is that in that sense, there is no Doval doctrine. See, there is Doval doctrine is often spoken of in the context really of Kashmir and Pakistan. But I think in the case of China, Mr. Doval follows a policy which is laid down by the Prime Minister. And I think the Prime Minister is very much involved, hands-on. And as I described to you, he's met Mr. Xi so many times. So there is no, it's not as though if Mr. Doval was kind of carrying on his own foreign policy, that the Prime Minister would not come to know about it. So Mr. Doval carries out the Prime Minister's foreign policy. And that's what he has been doing. Like, only thing is that, yes, he is a vigorous leader. So in the sense, in 2014, when Xi Jinping came to Ahmedabad and then to Delhi, and when the Chinese started acting up in Chumur, what Mr. Doval did was he did react very promptly and he was prepared for it. Meaning the Indian side anticipated, because this had happened when Li Keqiang was going to come in 2013. When Li Keqiang came in 2013, we had the Depsang incident. So this time the Indians were prepared and were there in strength. So there was a face-off, but the Doval doctrine was of greater vigor. And I must tell you, Raj, which I'm giving you is as a scoop. On July 31st, I was at the reception of the People's Liberation Army because of their 91st anniversary. And I was buttonholed by, I won't mention the diplomat, but he was extremely senior diplomat in the Chinese embassy. And while I was leaving, he tells me, this is a terrible situation. So I said, what's happened? He says, the Indians are intruding into Chinese territory. So I naturally smiled because I said, well, that's great, because normally the accusation's the other way around, So he said, no, you people have come in. And then he couldn't get the name because of the place. I said, Demchok. He said, yes, Demchok, you people have come in something like 14, 15 kilometers. So my smile became even broader. So, to know that, things are now, so if you are looking for that Doval doctrine, this is probably it. In the sense that what has happened, and it's not, Doval is not responsible. There is a reason for it. Because of the nature of the terrain, the Sino-Indian border terrain, it was much easier once the Chinese got into Tibet, built their roads, from Sichuan, Qinghai, and from the other road. They built their road, the railway, etc. So across the Tibetan plateau, their movement is very easy and quick, right up to their post. The Indian side is excruciating. Meaning, yes, we have 200 kilometers from the plains up to the mountains, but it's kind of very hard going. What has happened is that slowly but surely, India has actually built up now a communication network, road network. So you have patrols. So paradoxically enough, you have a greater Indian presence in the border than the Chinese presence. And the Chinese are now worried about the activity of the Indians. And most recently, what we have detected is signs that China is now building cantonments and things like that out there so that they can post the PLA guys there. See, the thing for an Indian soldier is that if an Indian soldier is about 2-3 days away from home, because it's 200 kilometers down and you can catch a train home. If you're a PLA guy and you're posted in the border with India, you're not going to get home before 15 days or what. It's you're in a godforsaken place, very far away from home. And so they're having difficulties. There are depopulation going on in certain parts of the border areas. China is becoming rich and it's doing well. So why should a Chinese guy be sitting in the godforsaken Sino-Indian border, instead of being in Shanghai or Shenzhen making money, So this problem has been there. So because now that Indians are now there in substantial strength right across the border, we are able to also do things which the Chinese used to do earlier, which put us on the defensive in the past. So this is a qualitatively new situation.
Rupak?
Thank you, Dr. Joshi, for your excellent lecture. Just one issue, two questions, short questions. One is on the infrastructure development in Northeast India. Do you think it's enough, because Arunachal still doesn't have a road which connects all the parts of Arunachal? For any Arunachali to travel between two places in Arunachal, he or she, including the Indian Army, has to come through the plains of Assam and then get to Arunachal again. So there is a road known as the Trans-Arunachal Highway, which is still under construction. So I think the infrastructure development on the Indian side is still very minimal at present. And secondly, on the issue of Tawang, I think why should India be cagey about allowing Dalai Lama into Tawang? Because Dalai Lama is a political figure. And this time the MOS for state...
Spiritual, no. India doesn't see as a political figure. Chinese
spiritual figure, sorry. Yeah. But this time the MOS for state, Mr. Kiren Rijiju, welcomed him in Tawang. So this might be a change in the stand, because earlier senior government, the GOI figures, have not welcomed the Dalai Lama. But this time the MOS state, who is himself a member of parliament from Tawang, was there to receive Dalai Lama in Tawang. So that may be a change, or what, not exactly a part of the Doval doctrine, but we see some changes.
Yeah. Well, you're right about the infrastructure. It's not. It's a long way, in the sense, I myself come from the mountains, and I've seen this all my life. I've been seeing it, meaning in the sense from a young man to now, the stage is that they're still building roads out there. It's difficult, very difficult. Roads collapse in the monsoon. In many areas, tunneling is now finally India's tunneling through and things like that. But still, compared to what it was, the Indian presence there is now very substantial, military presence. In fact, the Chinese military presence, notwithstanding what many Indians say, I don't agree with them, the Chinese military presence is pretty thin in Tibet. What they do have is a huge surge capacity. They have a surge capacity. It's just a question of Indian mentality is shaped by 1962. The experience of 1962. The Chinese don't have that, at the back of their mind. So what they say is that, okay, you guys can come 100 kilometers into Tibet, then what? By that time, we'll get 30 divisions into Tibet, and we can have a war. But Indians have that other thing that you come in 5 kilometers and everyone goes a bit haywire. The other point you made about Kiren Rijiju, the Dalai Lama may be a spiritual leader, we see it, but we all know that the Dalai Lama had a unique position. He may have himself stepped aside as the political leader, but all said and done, he's both. He's a political symbol, and he's for the Chinese, and having the Minister of State receive him, I think that was definitely a trigger for the Chinese. There was a Minister of State, and there was a local state minister also who had received him at that place in Tawang. Of course, as far as I'm concerned, I would not agree. I think that anyone can go to Tawang, come away from Tawang. But all I'm trying to say is that in terms of signaling, because you had earlier not allowed him for several years to go, and suddenly he goes there, it sends certain signals. I'm only doing it as an analyst. My personal view is something else.
Okay, if the guts up.
Mr. Chaudhary, fellow, but originally from Bangladesh. I have also followed some of your writings on my country, and particularly with regard to the elections and also China-India competition. My question is actually on the CBMs that you spoke about, and you said that there was a protocol problem because the link-up was with the DGMO, with the headquarters and the Western Commander. There is, of course, an Eastern Commander in India. So Why can't the CBM, the hotline be between the Eastern Commander and the Western Commander, or the DGMO and the counterpart in the headquarters? So is this a political issue rather than a protocol issue?
No, I think, I think it's just when this was decided, and as I said, this was only in the Indian press release, what the Indian officials told the Indian media, that hotlines between DGMOs. By saying DGMOs, it means that it was an Indian interpretation, because China doesn't have a DGMO.
But surely they have a
No. You see, the point is they have a completely, they have a theater-based command. You see, they don't have a headquarters like we have. So it is a technical issue. See, the idea, since it's a CBM, the idea is to find out the best solution. In the sense, in India, the DGMO is central to the military plans, So in China, we need an equivalent figure. The problem is, maybe we don't know. Maybe even the Chinese don't know, because they handle their issues in a different way. So I don't think it's a political issue. Mishra ji.
Yes. Okay, yes. So it has been a brilliant presentation so far. You mentioned earlier in your presentation that until and unless the border issues are not sorted out, relations between India and China will not improve. I would like to to put a point to you that even if the borders issue are done, are dealt with and sorted out, the relations between India and China will still not improve, because I think one issue that we didn't discuss here was Indian hegemony and the superpower rivalry between India and China. If you look at the relation at the non-Indian South Asian states, both especially countries like Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, the foreign policy of these countries, they struggle to actually balance their relations between India and China. And if you look at the progress India has made, its economy has gone a long way. Yeah, I'm just okay. And in the massive weapons spending, India wants to assert itself on the world stage, and China is not letting India do this, at least in South Asia. So do you think that this is actually the real issue and not really the mere borders skirmishes that we have been discussing about for the past 1 hour? Thanks.
Indian hegemony?
No,
Chinese
No, the thing is that what I was trying to do was to flag, say, if you look at the Wuhan summit, you get a lot of commentary saying, it's a transformative event. What I was trying to point out is that number one is the border. I didn't discuss the other things. So-called Indian hegemony, why I'll say that is, see, of all things, Indian hegemony is geographic. Okay? Now that's something which India can't do much about. No matter how you game it, from Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan, even to an extent Sri Lanka, it's very difficult to trump geography. As I said, I come from a mountain region next to Nepal, and trying to, there's nothing in Tibet. Or let us say, if you look at the China-Pakistan economic corridor, people are making into big, there is nothing in Xinjiang, nothing in Tibet. What kind of economic activity will be there which will then enrich Pakistan? The only way Pakistan can become a prosperous state is opening up to India. It has to open up its economy to India. That's the only way in which China will be able to recoup its investments in Pakistan, and CPEC will be able to work. Now, yes, you're right, 100% right, that one big temptation China has since 1963 used Pakistan to offset India in South Asia, meaning keeping India off balance in South Asia has been an important aspect of Chinese policy. Now the Chinese have to calculate that we will pay them back with the same coin. Whether it is in the Indo-Pacific or in the Indian Ocean, where geography favors us, okay? And the Chinese oil supply lines go, meaning just look at the map, look at how the oil travels, and you know that we also have certain trump cards. And as I said, geography has been a good friend of ours, at least in the Indian Ocean region. Now the Chinese have to realize, do they want the enmity or the tensions, to use a more polite word, with the world's greatest superpower, along with that the biggest state in the Indian Ocean region? And I don't think they want to. In fact, whatever discussions I've had with the Chinese, they keep on urging, they're saying that India should remain as a swing power, India should not jump into the American camp. So they are also kind of, there are policy differences there, because there's a temptation to use, the cheaper temptation to use Pakistan as a foil to India. And on the other hand, the larger calculation that if China is going to be a world power, China can't have a huge nuclear armed state as an adversary on its southern borders. I mean, it cannot, no great power can function like that.
Jivanta? Yeah,
Very much. Everything one here is like connecting to that question, actually. I mean, is the border the goal, or has it become an instrument and a part of the strategy of the relations between the two countries? In other words, is there any new thinking on actually how to resolve the problem? I mean, at one point, wasn't there an idea of some sort of Eastern-Western swap of mutually recognizing each? So is there any new ideas, or are we just going round and round in circles?
You know, the 2003, when Mr. Vajpayee went to Beijing, I think I also, you were there also, I think. Yeah? So both of us, we were part of the trip. Subsequently, and the special representatives were appointed by the two sides. And they said, what did that mean? It meant that they took the border issue from the officials and kicked it up to the political level and say that this, basically, the border can be settled by a political deal, full stop. Okay? So now they worked out the deal. In 2005, they signed an agreement on the political parameters and agreed guidelines of a border settlement. It had two interesting clauses. One clause said that in arriving at a settlement, the two sides will take into account the strategic interests of both sides. That's one clause. The second clause said, in working out the border, the two sides will take into account the settled populations on either side. Now, that meant essentially, when you say strategic interests, the Chinese road from Xinjiang to Tibet that goes through Aksai Chin, so India would take that into account. Settled population, Tawang, Arunachal Pradesh, so China would take that into account. So it essentially the swap. So in 2000, up to 2005, you actually have an agreement in your books. And so the two special representatives have been discussing precisely that. They've been discussing the fine points. Frankly, I have spoken to the special representative. They say, we've done our work. Now the question is, can Mr. Xi and Mr. Modi sit down and say, okay, guys, now on this framework, lay down the border. Now that is where the problem arises, because periodically what happened in 2005, within 2 months of the agreement being signed, India and US announced the Indo-US nuclear deal. And the Chinese were spooked because that took them aback, because, you know, unlike many commentators, they saw that this was not, it had nothing to do with nuclear power. It had to do with strategic relations between India and the US. It was, again, to use my old analogy, the nuclear issue, the nuclear sanctions, we were the most sanctioned country by the US. The nuclear issue was a pill stuck in the throat. It had to come out or go in, and the US, with President Bush there, agreed, we swallowed it. And so today that big issue, because if that had not gone away, we couldn't have had normal relations with the US. So this, what has happened is that since then the Chinese resiled. They went back on that, and this is a situation, now we are having talks after talks after talks, but frankly we already know that in this contemporary situation, there's going to be no big exchanges of territory. That's simply, you can do fixes here and there in those 20 places you can where you have an overlap, you can adjust the border, but no one's going to go and do big exchanges of territory. Yeah, Rani,
I just wanted to maybe also follow up on both Raj's question and Jivanta's, which is this question of whether Wuhan was less on substance, right? I mean, you said that the challenge for India is to have a competitive as well as a cooperative relationship. But since Wuhan, we've mostly seen sort of India doing steps that seem to be showing the cooperative part. So where is the competitive, where is the the real substance? And sort of looking forward, you mentioned the elections coming up. Can we expect anything going forward that would really be a sort of big change in this relationship? Will the promises of Wuhan really lead to any fruition in the next year or so?
Well, the competitive part also, I think when I say that India's, Mr. Modi's steps towards closer relationship with the United States is part of the competitive part. In the sense that by signaling very clearly this, for example, the Komkasa agreement has been stuck for almost 20 years. We've not been able to move ahead yet. So the Modi government has signaled that we're willing to arrive at a settlement with regard to that. This whole 2+2 format, now, which was supposed to have been held earlier. Now, this would have been, in the earlier calculation, it would have been held before Wuhan. Okay, now for a variety of reasons, it couldn't be held at that particular point in time. So I think what the Indian side has signaled is that we are maintaining both good relations with the United States, even closer relationship with the United States, even while reaching out to China and saying that, yes, we continue to cooperate. And this has been a pattern. This is not a new pattern. You know, after all, we are members of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. We are members of SCO. We are members of SICA. So, you know, so there is a cooperative element there, and these meetings with summit level meetings with China, they also constitute cooperative relationship. And my own hunch is that you might find cooperation in the Belt and Road Initiative thing, but without calling it Belt and Road Initiative. You know, in the sense, the formula we use with the United States, like we call that Komkasa used to be called something else. Now it's called Komkasa because we have, it's an India-specific agreement. So we may have an India-specific, like the third-party cooperation in Afghanistan. You know, that could be a connectivity cooperation between India and Afghanistan, India and China in Afghanistan. Now that formula could be done in Nepal, as I signaled. That if they construct one part of the railroad, we construct another part of the railroad, and it becomes one railroad. That's BRI without using the word BRI. So I think both of them are there. And as I said, substantively, I would go with what Raj has said, that, you know, there is the big rhetoric with Wuhan. Don't look at that. Because there are some very practical issues that dog the Indian-Chinese relationship. Their big target has to be to deal with those, which is the border issue, the Pakistan issue, Chinese efforts to displace India in South Asia. So these are the practical issues. So the other stuff, you know, the Asian century and all that kind of stuff, that is strictly,
For the birds. Okay, Dipinder.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi. My question is on a slightly different trajectory. It's about the role of domestic politics in China and how that's shaping foreign policy imperatives. Since February, there's been a great deal of disquiet about the changes in the Constitution and the assumption of Xi thought becoming part of the Constitution. And this found expression last week in the writings of Professor Xu Zhangru. It was very assertive, and one of the themes that was raised, aside from the personality politics and the banning of Winnie the Pooh and now even Peppa the Pig, was about a very assertive foreign policy that is not in accord with Deng's original vision of a peaceful, peaceful rise. And this specifically addresses the issue of the 9-dash line, the very belligerent response to Trump's trade protectionism. Do you see any, and it's found expression in a number of other bilateral relationships. In your research and your conversations, do you find any signs of change or a greater degree of belligerence or assertiveness, or even internal debate for that matter?
You see, as you know, China is a famously opaque country, okay? And you're right, that article came out. And so far, there have been no consequences for that professor. But another guy, I think he was giving an interview to Voice of America, and the police were trying to break down his
the interview was going on.
his door. So also in the Weibo, in the websites, I've seen even more alarming stuff, that there were sounds of gunfire and explosion near Chungnanhai, and Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin have combined forces. And
writing a letter that they
you know,
wrote.
so a lot has been, the thing with China is that everything seems fine when everything looks fine, appears fine, but it's not fine. And that happens one fine day, and something or the, I mean, say you look at Shun Zhengkai, who was the leader of Chongqing. One fine day, he was supposed to be a possible entrant into the Politburo Standing Committee, and one fine day he's kind of taken to jail and charged with something. Now, Xi Jinping obviously has big enemies. He's made enemies. There is a lot of resistance to him, but the CPC functions as a disciplined kind of a military. It is a kind of a military kind of a formation, and it's very difficult on the surface to see what is happening. But yet you're having, veterans protests in China. So far, the one area of reform where Xi has been successful has been the military. He has managed to transform the military, but at a cost. Don't forget the two vice chairmen of the CMC have been put in jail, and several other senior officers have been removed. But in terms of foreign policy, I think that we are being a bit by blaming Xi. Actually, the inflection point is 2008, when the financial crisis in the West. So what happened was the West went down a couple of notches. The Chinese successfully they went up a couple of notches, and it's 2008 when the Olympics took place. Despite everything, that's the point in time. And why do I say that? Because if you go to the Japanese will tell you that 2008 is the point where earlier there used to be 2 ships coming to Senkaku Islands. Suddenly the numbers started, and the same thing started happening in South China Sea after 2000.
Even our border.
Even our border, we started having. So the real point is then, and I have no doubt in my mind that it would have been something which would have been cleared by the Politburo itself, and certainly not Xi. Xi comes much later into the picture. And many of the things, that much you have to hand it to the Chinese system. It works as a fairly disciplined unit. So Xi may be president for life or whatever it is, but the Politburo Standing Committee still reflects, different factions of Chinese politics, and that's not going away. And the present situation that Xi has to cope with, he would have the full support of the system, because they know that either you hang together or you hang separately. That's the reality.
Diego, you wanted to? Yeah, I'll come to you.
Thank you. I'm Diego Majorana. I'm a fellow here at ISIS. And I just have a curiosity. I went to a seminar in the UK a few weeks ago, and the speaker had done field work in villages in Arunachal Pradesh, in no man's land, basically. Villages that it's not clear whether they are in India or China. And she told us that there is some sort of a race between the Indian and the Chinese to develop these villages, building clinics, schools, roads, much more successful on the Chinese part.
Berenice, you're talking about Berenice's work, right?
Pardon?
Berenice, you're talking about her work?
Berenice, yeah.
Exactly. And she didn't know whether this was a part of a larger and more structured policy of the Indian or the Chinese or both. So I'm asking you this question.
Yeah, well, I think Berenice has a particular theory about, controlling that particular area. And definitely there's no doubt in my mind that I wouldn't say competition, because the two sets of people are different. Meaning there's no ethnic similarity between. It's not it's not a Korea where you have the North Koreans and South Koreans speaking the same language and living across this thing. These are completely ethnically different groups on either. So there is it's not as though India is trying to show the Tibetans that our Tibetans are better. We don't have Tibet. We have a few of them refugees who are living in Arunachal. Likewise, the people living in Tibet, have really nothing to do with the people living in Arunachal. They are not ethnically, linguistically similar to them in any particular way. But yes, there are development imperatives. As far as India is concerned, as I said, I also come from the mountains, but from a more, what should I say, more settled part of the mountains, which is better developed. But you go to the northern parts of the mountains and people will tell you that if there was no trouble with China, the government would not have built our roads. Because it takes a lot of effort. I mean, building a road up in the Himalayas is a major problem. And you should see what has happened. You see, the Chinese built the road from Kashgar to Abbottabad in Pakistan, the Kunjera highway, the Karakoram highway. Some years ago, 74 kilometers of it vanished. It just collapsed. And a huge lake came up called the Attabad Lake. And so they've had to tunnel around it and do all kinds of things. So it's a pretty horrible terrain out there. So building these highways, etc. And there has always been a question of the ecology. This has been a big concern in India. In fact, our army has complained about it, saying that we don't get land to build cantonments because the environment will be affected. Now this new government has said that we are willing to overlook the rules. But many state governments, after all, their interest is with their local people. You see, so they want to promote their interests, and they wouldn't want big army cantonments kind of taking over prime land in their area. So that is an issue.
So can you just pass the microphone here?
No,
it's being recorded. So.
One question only. Do you think this is the time for India to be inducted in the United Nations Security Council, where it certainly deserves a place? And what are the forces that are preventing it?
That brings you to the subject of China.
Actually, I'm one of those who believes that it serves no real purpose for us to be in the UNSC. When our time comes, it will come. And I think that right now, I find it as a distracting issue. Because if you are in the security, whatever proposal, I think last time Nikki Haley came to India, she discussed this, and she said, why don't you guys come in minus this veto? So, the point is that I personally have never been a great advocate. I think that, yes, I think, like all patriotic people, I think India should be a power of reckoning, an economic and military power. But if it comes to the UN and UN Security Council, when your time comes, you will be inducted.
Srikanth, you wanted to say something? No? You had anything? Ronaji, you wanted to say something?
Just to draw on that, pill in the throat analogy, you were talking about the border issues being really the major sort of issue between India and China. To switch the focus to the other side, would you describe Kashmir also as the sort of, the pill in the throat, or we always talk about low-hanging fruits, etc. So just to get your opinion on the other, neighbor.
No, I think to be very fair, the Chinese have actually had quite a balanced policy on Kashmir. When they signed an agreement with Pakistan, that Pakistan transferred the Shaksgam Valley to them. And so when they signed the agreement, there is a clause in that agreement of 1963 which says that this agreement is subject to the final determination of the status of Kashmir. So in the sense, they held out the possibility that maybe India will this thing, so then they will have to negotiate with India on that area. Subsequently, also, they have taken a fairly balanced position with regard to Kashmir. Let me put it another way. They could have, if they wanted to embarrass us, they could have had some of these insurgents setting up a Tibetan government in exile. You could have had a Kashmiri government in Kashgar, Kashmiri government in exile in Kashgar. So they're not into minor games. You see, that's not an issue with them. I think they also understand what I said earlier. There's not going to be any large-scale change of territory, territory changing hands in the present situation. So, in that kind of thing, they basically see that India will be controlling this particular area, and they are willing to live with it.
You got holding on the microphone, but if you are very short, because you're the only one.
No,
Yeah.
I don't want to monopolize the.
No, we already had 15 questions. So if you are brief a second time, so we can.
No, it's fine.
No, go ahead. Ask. We're going to close after that.
Oh, I see. Okay. So this is again addressed to both of you. Dr. Joshi, you used the term balancing, as in the context of India, balancing China as well as the US interests with regard to these two. So, so do you recognize that, for instance, is it from your perspective?
Just keep the short
No.
question. No, for instance, cut out for instance and I'll just pose a straightforward question. I mean,
the straightforward question is, the Shangri-La dialogue was a massive strategic shift by the US and the Western powers, France, Britain, as well as Germany. And the Indian Navy was put in the forefront of it. As in, the Indian Navy...
again, question, please. Just
the
ask,
question is this a massive shift? That is one. You said balancing, and you said transactional, every country is... oh yeah, you used the word idealistic. Now, you claim that foreign policy is not idealistic. Now, Indian foreign policy has followed the Nehruvian model
Question.
in this region. Sir, I have to form a...
Look, I think you're getting a second time. Just pose a simple question. Look, you're saying Indian foreign policy is idealistic. You're saying, is that the question or?
No, I'm asking you, if foreign policy is supposed to be transactional, as it is right now, things can go wrong.
Okay.
Especially
So,
in the
yeah.
South China Sea and Indian Ocean. I mean, isn't it better for Modi to modernize his navy? PLA is far more advanced.
That was a good question.
Thank
That's
you.
a good question. Manoj, you study the military, the modernization of the...
Definitely, but don't forget that India's primary interests are the Indian Ocean. And not only is it the Indian Ocean, it is the Western Indian Ocean, which means the Persian Gulf, the Northern Arabian Sea, oil supplies coming from there. Plus, as you know, we have interests in Seychelles, Mauritius, Eastern Africa, etc. This is the primary area of our interests. In that sense, the Pacific in this area is a new area. And I'll be very frank, there's a lot of calculation there. A lot of it is also to send a signal to China. Very clearly, because China is involved in South Asia. So basically what we are also signaling is that we can also operate in an area of your interest. So it's a balancing kind of a game. So I don't think that is going to change. As far as the modernization is concerned, each country has its own pace. India is a democracy. It's very difficult in India to tell the people that, instead of infrastructure, we're going to build the navy. The people will throw you out in the next election. You see, so there is, and so we know, people who live in India know that we have a huge challenge in trying to transform our infrastructure. So a lot of investment, a lot of effort by the government is towards that direction, building roads, building ports, building other things. And so, in fact, the defense has been squeezed pretty badly. The defense sector has been very badly squeezed. And I think that situation will not change. And I think it will be unconscionable for it to change, because you can't tell the average Indian that we are off to fight the Chinese in South China Sea when your infrastructure is in third-rate condition.
Okay, I think we'll need to bring this to a close. I mean, we're almost close to the thing. I mean, I think I won't try to summarize what's happened in the last hour and a half. I think we've covered a large number of issues. I think for the Institute of South Asian Studies, I mean, China is the central theme. I mean, I think whether we study the economies of South Asia, where for all the countries today, including India, China is the largest trading partner for many of smaller countries in South Asia. It's also the biggest investor. It's also likely to become a major investor in India. Second, on the infrastructure issues, whether we like BRI or not, BRI is in South Asia. And I think some of the consequences, of course, we're going to deal with it, whether in Sri Lanka, today the arguments in Pakistan about the China-Pakistan corridor. So again, I mean, I think in the longer term, if you think of the region, again, the Chinese BRI, Chinese infrastructure projects, many of them precede actually the announcement of the BRI, are also going to be real. Third, I think in terms of the alliances, balances, if you look at how the region is playing itself out, China again looms large. And I think this is not surprising because China is the second largest economic power today in the world, soon to overtake the United States in aggregate terms. It's also the second largest military power. South Asia is a neighbor to China. Therefore, the impact of China on the subcontinent is going to be huge. And within that, of course, what happens between India and China is an important thing. But I would say at least 3-4 things I think have come through, in the discussion. One is both India and China are masters at folk tongue, shall we say, or two ways of talking about the same thing. For example, if you go back to the so-called Panchsheel, both of them said, we don't interfere. The whole principle was supposed to be non-intervention, because China supported a whole range of Naxalite and other Maoist movements in India. India was supposed to have supported the Tibetan movement, including along with the Americans. So we violated that agreement the moment we signed it, sincerely, determinedly violated that agreement. So this idea somehow was caught. So I think the important thing for those of us who are doing research in the region, don't go by the words. Don't go by the rhetoric, but go by their actions. And I think it is the actions and actual policies that's going to tell us more, rather than the declaratory rhetorical flourish that India and China bring to the table. They don't always mean what they say. So we got to take a look at the more substantive parts of it. And I think that must be a constant guide, because often we are tempted to read the joint statements and take off from there. And I think one of the things you did today was to actually temper that way of approaching the relationship. The second, I think, is important thing as we look ahead is the asymmetry that has emerged between India and China. 25 years ago, 30 years ago, you could say India and China in the same breath. Of course, many of us still say it in the same breath. India, China, great Asian civilizations, billion-plus populations, rising Asian giants. But all that hides the fact that Chinese GDP today is 5 times larger than India's GDP. China is $14 trillion. India is at 2.6. That gap, I believe, will continue to grow, even if India does fantastically well and China doesn't do too well in the next 20 years, because it'll be a huge time before India can catch up, assuming all things go well for India and things don't go well for China. Even then, the gap will remain a central feature of the India-China relationship. And I think that is going to play itself into the third element on the question of alliances. We might pretend we are non-aligned and we don't do alliances, but India's relationship with the Soviet Union was clearly meant to balance the Chinese in the 1970s. India's engagement with the US on Tibet was meant to balance the Chinese. India's relationship with Vietnam was meant to balance the Chinese. I'm talking about the 70s, I'm not talking about today. And China's relationship with Pakistan, or future relationships with the smaller states of India, is also about balancing India. So balancing, well, rhetoric says balance is a bad word, but fairly India and China pretty good exponents in doing that. So I think there again, we got to see how this balance of power politics plays out amidst the asymmetry that exists between India and China. The other aspect is the hegemony. You don't like Indian hegemony, but problem is not having intention of hegemony, but it is of exercising hegemony. Hegemony is real hegemony when it's accepted by the others. That you can claim, look, India can say, look, I'm the hegemon. You think Maldives believes India is a hegemon? You think Pakistan believes India is a hegemon? I mean, they have an alliance with China. So I think it's one thing, again, I think don't fall for the rhetoric that British Raj was the hegemon. But I think the moment there was partition, there was multiple states, India has never been able to exercise the kind of hegemony that the British Raj did. And I think within that, of course, there are geographic interdependencies between India and its neighbors that you can't ignore. And even when they're trying to balance India, again, balancing is not a bad word. If India can balance the Chinese, why wouldn't Sri Lanka balance India with going to the Chinese or whoever they can find? So balance again, I think it's a 101 in international politics. Every country tries to balance. So it's not again a shocking thing that happens in our region. But the key is, how does this play out? Can India's rising economic power make it attractive to limit the balancing behavior of its neighbors? Or can China make it harder for India to do that? That is the research that we hope we can do, that pointing out what are the alternative structures. An Indian economy that was closed did not give too much hope to the neighboring economies, but today an Indian economy that's open, can it give more hope? Those are the kind of issues that we need to deal with, and those of us who are doing research, I think those are the issues that are going to be quite fascinating. And I think there again, I think we didn't touch much on the economic thing, that as Chinese begin to invest, not just in, as Manoj said, South Asia, India is the biggest market. The CPEC is connected to India will have a dramatically different outcome than if it's a mere thing that's running through along the Indus into the Arabian Sea. Similarly, the BCIM, where Indian participation could make the transformation. But therefore, and in the new emerging areas where China is a leader in a number of areas like fintech, with Chinese investments in India and Paytm and other new emerging companies is fairly serious. That again, I think is something that we need to look at seriously. And lastly, I think on the question of territoriality, that India and China today, the declared maps cannot be complete without some sense of resolution of the boundary dispute. China shows the map Arunachal is in it, which is not true. India controls it. India shows the beautiful whole of Kashmir in India. It is not. Part of it is with Pakistan, part of it is with the Chinese. So the very maps that the two countries depict to themselves are not true. Are claimed maps, not real maps. And I think there is no way, well, Kashmir, we think of it as an India-Pakistan issue. Actually, China is very much part of it. And therefore, the Chinese territoriality, the Indian territoriality, how we resolve that. And within that framework, the Tibet question keeps coming up. There again, I mean, I think, what is the nature of India's relationship with Tibet? Will it be in a classical Westphalian model forever? Or would there be alternative ways of constructing it? Some new ideas came up. Again, that's something we need to research. Can there be an ecclesiastical solution where you give freedom for the Tibetan Buddhists or Buddhists in Indian side, in Tawang? Can you construct solutions that transcend brutal Westphalian claims of sovereignty? Can we fudge things on the margins? Can we make sure that, look, there are ways in which both sides can benefit without seen as giving up their territorial claims? So I think these are the new solutions that we'll have to find, and I suspect those kind of solutions will only come when significant change in the external conditions take place, that is, nature of China's relationship with the major powers, that changes significantly. Or Dipinda raised the question of what's happening inside. Inside has a big effect on outside. The whole Maoist, the 62 war, Lin Biao, what the rise of the Cultural Revolution, what it did to the Indian thing. Similarly, the rise of Indian nationalism post-62, that continues to haunt the relationship. So I think those are the unpredictable variables, that the internal and the external. If those conditions change, there again, I think there could be outcomes that are very, very different. But in the meanwhile, I think China remains as a core interest for ISAS, and we hopefully will continue to study that in its multiple manifestations. Thank you, Manoj. Please join me in thanking Manoj for coming. Thank you.